A warm welcome to our discussion tonight on neurofeedback and primitive reflexes. Before we get started, perhaps it's time to just grab a pen and a pencil, a piece of paper, so that as we go through this presentation, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to discuss further, you can jot it down, so that right at the end we can just have a time where perhaps we can just discuss some of these things that you might have questions about, or whatever the case is. But before we get started, just a disclaimer. The information provided in this presentation is for educational and informational purposes only. I am not a medical doctor, and nothing in this presentation represents medical advice, nor is it intended to treat, cure, or mitigate any conditions or disease. Always seek advice from your own medical provider and or your medical health provider regarding any questions or concerns you have about your specific health. And so without further ado, let's get going. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kerry-Ann Gordon. I am an educational kinesiologist, a movement facilitator and trainer, a neurofeedback trainer. I'm able to train quite a number of movement courses, and I've also developed a few myself, just bringing together from all the different things that I've studied, some aspects that people might be interested in knowing. I started my journey as a teacher, and so starting my journey as a mother and teacher, I found very quickly that I was ill-equipped to help not only my own children in the classroom, but my own children in my house. And I began asking questions. Why is it that some children learn and some don't? What is the missing link? How, with my years of studying to be a teacher, am I not able to do the things that I need to do? I can see potential in these children, and yet I see that they're failing to reach that full potential. And that's what set me off on this journey to then go beyond teaching and study educational kinesiology, movement facilitating, and of course neurofeedback. So many of my educate colleagues will know exactly what this page is all about as I ask you to think about a goal going into this evening. If you're new to educate and the way that we work, we always begin by asking what your goal is. What is the purpose of putting aside an hour tonight to come and listen into what Kerry-Ann Gordon has to say? What is your intentions? Because, you know, we only ever disappointed when our own expectations aren't met. And so a very good practice is to always to set some expectations for ourselves and to monitor them. What is going to hinder us really truly getting involved in tonight's session? Yes, and again, what you put in, you're going to get out. So I jotted some down. Perhaps if you've never done this, you might want to borrow one of mine. But I thought perhaps you might be here to find out more about neurofeedback this evening. If you are someone who's gone a bit along the route of educate or has looked into primitive reflexes, you might be coming from that point of view. Maybe you might understand what this big word primitive reflex actually means. And now you want to see how we can see its effect in the brain. Perhaps you want to understand how neurofeedback may complement your work. Again, I'm thinking very much so of my educate colleagues. Maybe you have to get clarity. What is this thing? You know, it looks weird, it looks crazy. Okay, maybe it's to become more aware of possible modalities that can support you as you work on yourself or as you work with loved ones. Maybe tonight is just to have some me time. Maybe you just need a break and you want to come sit in and listen to some people who might be like-minded individuals. Maybe you see tonight as a time to invest in yourself and of course to gain some more understanding. And so whatever your goal is, if I've listed it, if I haven't, please jot it down. Again, even if it's as a little exercise for yourself to understand how jotting a goal down can really create a sense of excitement as we head into the session. So what is neurofeedback? Let me explain to you as Kerry best explains. I break words up for myself. So neuro, nerves or neurons in this case as we look at the brain, and feedback, helpful information to improve performance. So neurofeedback works by supplying the brain with helpful information in reaction or in response to its functioning so that the brain can self-correct. And so we are harnessing, using neurofeedback, neuroplasticity, so the brain's ability to adapt and change, using operant conditioning. And operant conditioning is when we modify our behavior, or in this case, the brain modifies its functioning as it's given consequences for its actions. So again, really, really important as we start harnessing this very natural ability of the brain and the person to develop. We need to understand that with neurofeedback, we can provide the brain with pure feedback, and then the brain can take this and use it to start shifting the way in which it's working. So we do this naturally in life, and you can understand, maybe if you're a people pleaser like myself, you can probably spot when you've done it maybe more on purpose, and then it's been more of a conscious thing than a subconscious thing. But let's go right back to when we were little, and of course we absolutely thrived when we were praised and celebrated, and we were given cuddles and hugs and rewards for our positive behavior. And of course how we didn't like to be in trouble, and we'd work very hard to not be in trouble. But sometimes, you know, the feedback that we were getting from our environment and the people in the environment wasn't very consistent. For instance, maybe I do something naughty, but mom was in a really good mood that day. She just got a promotion. She had lunch with a friend. I don't know what. And of course, I just get called a silly Billy. But the next day, I do the same thing. And now mom's driving in the rain, in traffic, and she's late, and there's taxis cutting in front of her. I don't have to paint too much of a picture, but I'm sure you're going to realize that you're going to get a very different response to that same little behavior where you were just called a silly Billy the day before. Let's change this up a bit as we start saying, okay, well, mom reacts one way, but then off I go to the classroom, and in grade 1, I've got one teacher, thank goodness, and she reacts a different way. But then I go to grade 4 and grade 5, and we have got a different teacher every half an hour. And so this world that I have that's giving me the feedback that I need to take and use to mature and to develop and grow doesn't end up being very consistent. But somehow we manage, don't we? Well, neurofeedback, the software, is really, really consistent as it provides the same response when we see the brain doing what we want it to do, and of course the same response when it doesn't, which means the brain can work out very quickly what it is that it should be doing. Oops, sorry, 2 jumped up there. So just let's talk about some jargons that's going to come up as you engage with neurofeedback. So if you want to come for a neurofeedback assessment, we're going to be calling that a brain mapping session. And here we are mapping how the brain is using energy. We want to know where it's working too fast, where it's working too slow, where it's working too hard, where it's not working hard enough. And this brain energy we measure in brain waves. I just wanted to add this really important explanation of energy being the ability to do work, because that's exactly what we're wanting to understand. So when we look at this, we want to understand, as we put the little electrodes on each side of the head, we want to understand if the brain has the ability to do the task it needs to do, if it's got enough energy to meet the challenge that it needs to function properly. What we also then ask as we look at this data is we ask our clients, what is it that you want to change? Where are the areas in your life where you feel that you are struggling? And it's through this lens that we then interpret these brain waves. And so with this information, what we can then do, and the sole purpose of neurofeedback, not to diagnose, but rather to create a plan, a personalized plan to train the brain. So that's the other word that you're going to hear. You're going to hear brain training sessions. And those are the sessions where you're going to come back in. Once we've got all this info, we're going to put the electrodes back onto the specific points on the head where we want to work. And then, of course, our software is reading brain activity in real time and giving the brain feedback, whether it's moving in the right direction or the wrong direction. And why I love neurofeedback so much, this is a non-invasive, drug-free manner in which to help the brain work more efficiently. It works because of the brain's neuroplasticity, which we are now harnessing. So the equipment. So this is exactly how my equipment looks. I bought my equipment through Brain Trainer International. This is their stuff. And so I love talking about it because I think it's just so fancy. Imported from the US, and really high quality equipment, as I say. I love the cap, that big black interesting shaped, it looks like something the rugby players wear. It's a way that I can get to each of the sites on the head very quickly, and I don't have to use paste then on the hair. So a lot of people do use paste, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that when you leave, you actually have to give yourself a nice little, I don't know, get a wet tissue and just make sure that your hair is not standing up. Whereas with this, I can use saline solution. So the little electrodes that you see on the side there, they are for reading electricity. And so is obviously my amp there. People usually get quite worried when they see all of this. This is why I wanted to show you, because they think of, I don't know, Frankenstein, shock therapy. I don't know what we've been conditioned to think. But truly, the reason why we are using electrodes is because we are reading, yes, electricity, but the electricity that we're trying to read is not in the wire, is not in the amp. It's the electricity in your brain. And so if I need to read electricity, I need equipment that can do so. And so yes, here's what I use. As I can say, if you just want to go through that list, I've got the cap, the electrodes, we've got electrodes that go on the ears, we've got the amp, that's that white and blue box sitting there. And then of course I use the software, lovely software. They update it and I subscribe, so it's always being updated as I just turn it on. And this is what we're using. So in my brain training sessions, my software, as I say, it reads brain activity in real time. It compares it to the protocol that I've set, and then as I explained it earlier on, it then feeds back that information that the brain needs to self-correct. What kind of reward or feedback do we get? So no, we don't shock you every time. Every time your brain does the wrong thing. I'm going to show you in just a minute what happens here with eyes open. What you can't see is that the person watching this has got the protocol running, and they've also got earphones on their head, and they're listening to music at the same time. Every time the brain does what we want it to, the music continues to flow. Every time the brain doesn't, it starts not jumping, but it kind of loops a bit. And the point is that you as the person are not meant to actually pick up on it. You're meant to be sitting, relaxing. If you have eyes open, you get to watch something on YouTube, and you're going to notice at the same time that the screen dims and brightens quite quickly. And this is in response to this person's brain as they are doing their brain training session. So let's just take a look. You're not going to hear anything, but what you will see is the screen as it brightens and dims. Okay, so very short snippet there, but that's basically it. I'm doing brain training with a young boy at the moment, and he, after his third session, said, "So I really don't have to do anything." I said, "No, you really don't have to do anything. You come in, you sit back, you relax, you put on these headphones, and yes, there is some music going, but it's really up to you just to relax and enjoy." As I say, with eyes open, we watch something on the screen, eyes closed, you're just listening to the music. But you are not meant as a person to consciously be aware of what the brain is getting right or wrong. It's completely for the brain to pick up on this feedback and start using it. So that's how my clients look, you see, relaxed in the chair. In this case here, we are not using EEG, but we're using HEG. Now, not all neurofeedback practitioners actually have HEG. I've been really, really blessed to bring in 2 of these brand new state changes. And what you will notice slightly on this plastic Alice band that goes over the forehead, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a bit of a grey thing. In there we have infrared light, and it's training blood flow up to the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for all of your executive functioning skills. The reason why we have to use HEG there is because we can't put the electrodes so close to the eyes, because unfortunately with the eye movement, the brain starts to pick it up and think the software picks it up as brain activity. And so we don't want to be training eye movement. We really want to be training the brain. And so yes, as we increase blood flow to that area, it brings oxygen and glucose, and that will equal better activity there. So just to show you, this is what she's actually doing on the computer. She's playing a game. You can see her hands are folded, and this game is played just by concentrating. And you'll see the cool little game on the screen here as the person, as they focus. In this case, they're supposed to be doing open focus, so it's like paying attention to the environment, and then she's supposed to go down into the water, and then once she's done with that, we will change it up and ask her to zone in onto the detail, and so that's called closed focus. And as she's able to do that, the little icon will go up. So let me just show you. Okay, and then as you see, as she goes down or in the right direction, she gets little fishes as rewards. This is what I will see on my screen during a neurofeedback assessment. So now I can't see your brain, I can't read your thoughts. What we got at the top, those beautiful color bars, I'll push play in a minute and you'll see them they look quite pretty as they extend out and then come back. That's the brain waves. If you look at the little squiggly lines just under that, that's the full EEG at the site that I'm busy checking. And then at the bottom, I'm looking for muscle tension and eye tension. Unfortunately, this client did have something going on with his eye, which we ended up having a bit of a discussion around after we had done this. So let's get now to the energy, let's get to the brain things. And we need to start by understanding slow brain waves, medium brain waves, and fast brain waves. And so our very first slow brain wave is called delta. We see this, about 50% of this in newborns, and we see only about 10% of alpha there. We also see delta in deep sleep, and it's really important for cellular repair. We also see it if there's lesions in the brain. And we've got this beautiful little 3 hertz, I say beautiful, but you'll see in each band there's something important that's happening there. So 3 hertz is where our old emotional trauma kind of sits. Theta, for many of us who've done our pros balloon, we all got that theta little music that we listen to. And of course we like it because this is the place we want to get into, like a hypnotic state. Hey, we see it during infancy. We see this increase. Our theta increase, and we're supposed to see delta starting to reduce a little bit more. Theta has to do with image processing, and this is why when we dream also in pictures, and we're going to talk a bit about it in alpha, this visualization as well, but this is where we're heading towards there. 7 hertz is where we've got memory consolidation, and we are integrating material. Now important here, very important for those of us who are going to remember this with the reflexes, that these actually come from the brainstem. These are actually almost broadcast out from certain brain structures. So we want this to be seen across the brain. Wherever I look, we want it to be synchronized, if that makes sense. So our bridging ones become our medium brainwave, alpha being one of them. And alpha is all about mental stillness, pure awareness, but without processing. It's used in visualization, so many people who do meditation try to get into this alpha state. It's when we are calm in the moment, when we are on autopilot, so we're not working overly hard on things that we don't need to waste energy on. We are in this resting state, and we see this a lot in toddlers as they're starting to connect to their environment. Another medium brainwave is called SMR. So this is actually a slower version of the fast brain waves in a certain part of the brain. And it is described as the body's alpha. So this mental stillness that I achieve through alpha in the brain, the physical stillness I experience through this SMR. So when it's at the right place, it should allow me to feel present, warm and heavy, and we get our, at 14 hertz, we get activity in the circadian rhythms, sleep onset, and screening, which we're going to talk about, this filtering system that is so important. And so these form part of my medium brain waves. Okay, so medium brain waves come from the thalamus. And then we have a whole lot of fast brain waves, from ones that are helping me to process to the ones in red here that are not very helpful at all. And so beta, okay, we get beta 1, we get beta 2, and then we get high beta. So beta we start seeing around the age of 4 to 5, and it becomes consistent around age 12. Beta 1 is detail orientated. It's to do with calculations. It's to do with extraction of meaning. Another very important thing about beta is it's the language brainwave, where theta is the image brainwave, or the image brain waves. Beta is the language brainwaves. Okay. And of course, as I read those words, you can understand how important it would be for academics, for concentration, for work. Okay. We get then to beta 2. You can see it's now becoming a bit faster, and now I can see that this person is extremely engaged, they're highly focused, they're curious, but they're possibly starting to get anxious as well. And then we shift into the red, high beta. So this is hypervigilance, absolute extreme. We don't want to see this because we have anxiety. It relates to post-traumatic stress disorder or even abuse history. And so when we shift into this state, we can just imagine how we're super, super alert. We're looking for danger where there isn't. And we actually are stuck in the sympathetic mode, which is not good when we can't move in and out of that as we need to. So our fast brain waves, we see this coming from the cortices, so the outer parts of the brain. Also get gamma. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done on that, and while some of our protocols deal with it, it's not something that we really dive deep into. From 0 to 25, we see this increasing average speed of activity, and this is concurrent with the myelination of axons. Myelination, it means then that these longer axons are getting the sheath, which is usually, which is made from our omegas, our fatty acids. And the better that sheath, the faster we can actually have these brain waves moving up and down. And then from 25 to 50, we start seeing a decrease. We see less than 5% delta. Alpha should be 60 to 70% at the rear, and then beta at the front. So that's the pattern we're going to talk about. But as we get older, as I was getting into there, 50 plus, we start seeing a slowing of these dominant frequencies. So now we've got to look at all the nice equipment and that. Let's head back to where things just seem to steer off course. And so when I had to explain this to somebody, I thought, and the best way was to explain that it all starts with stress. So the word stress has to do with, if we go and Google it, it has to do with the fact that we have these invisible forces acting on a material. So when we have a roof truss, and of course we've got these forces acting on it, the roof truss stands, but over years, if we see that it's been in the sun, it's maybe been exposed to the elements, and the structure itself begins to weaken and is less resilient, we see in time that this truss may wither away, and very soon we might have a roof that collapses. So how does stress relate to the body? And of course, as we understand that we've got these invisible forces coming at us from all sides, we might begin to understand that this could be emotional, this could be physical, this could be mental, and of course so much more. And so first of all, we begin our life with mom and dad, and of course they used to believe that a child had a clean slate, and now through epigenetics they've started to realize that this might not be the case. And so many children have these genetic predispositions already in the womb. As we are being developed and we're in the womb, we are also safe, and we, in this sense, if we look at the polyvagal theory, we kind of in this freeze mode. But it's while we're in the womb that we also need these primitive reflexes, which are automatic moves, to start coming online. And they start readying the baby already in utero to respond to the world that it's been born into. Dr. Bruce Lipton explains it beautifully when someone was asked, Why is it that a baby in utero will experience the negative emotions from mommy through the blood, through the chemicals being passed on? And his explanation for that was due to the fact that this baby needs to get ready for this life that it's going to be born into. Is this child coming into a world where they need to protect themselves? Are they going to be in this, or need to be in this survival mode? Or are they moving into an environment where they can thrive? And so as these primitive reflexes are coming online, as they're experiencing emotions through mom, her heartbeat, her voice, and all this development's taking place, they also eventually need to move to a place where they're ready to be born. They need to drop, they need to turn, they need to shift into position. And of course, when they are born, they're going to move then into fight or flight as they have the opportunity to move through their birth canal, using these reflexes that have come online to help themselves be born. And then as they're born, and they're born into this loving family, and they get the opportunity to connect and bond and move, so the neurons start developing and myelinating. It's very important to understand that when we are born with everything fully formed except our brain. And there's some theories that it's to help us get through the birth canal, but beyond that, we really need to be in this world and be experiencing life and the sensations of living for us to continue to develop this brain, which is a highly adaptive system. Very, very interesting. Again, you can have twins, people born in the same family, to the same household, going through similar events, and yet our brains are still going to be different due to the fact that we perceive and understand and value different things. And so we form connections due to our own experience and our understanding of it. Another thing that a lot of people are looking into is the fact that there's possibly this mitochondrial dysfunction. So mitochondrial is a part of the cell that gives the body energy, but it's far more complicated than that, and they found that it also has to do with neurotransmitters and much, much more. And so we also need to understand on a very physical level if the body actually has enough energy to actually perform what it, the function of developing and growing and interacting. We look at our nervous system, and of course when this doesn't go as it should, that's when we have these problems. And that's of course my little brain that we have to have a look at neurofeedback to see what is going on. So primitive reflexes, let's get into it. If I say reflexes, you're probably thinking of going off to the doctor and then he smacks your knee with that hammer, and then of course he wants to see the leg jump out, and of course if it doesn't, then he looks very concerned. And in that we understand that reflexes are automatic. You don't have control over your knee shooting out when he does that. Now primitive reflexes are reflexes that shouldn't actually be there when you have passed infancy and you're now able to stand and walk. These are in actual fact automatic moves that we see done by infants and babies, and they are there for a few reasons. First of all, as I just said in the previous slide, with a brain that's not fully developed, that needs to move, we need certain movements that are automatic there so that the baby can start engaging in the world and moving towards their milestones. And of course what we want to see is, as the brain develops, that automatic movements are then replaced with voluntary movements, that these are no longer needed and that they shouldn't be triggered anymore. When they are triggered, they cause a bit of an interruption in the body, with information coming into the brain and then information from the brain going out. And so while tonight's just a quick discussion on this, we've got many courses that you can get in touch with us to find out more about. But I'd also like you could also look at a doctor called Dr. Robert Malelo. So he's an expert in developmental functional neurology, brain imbalances, hemispheric integration, and he is the founder of the Malelo method and is involved in the correction of neurobehavioral disorders and learning disabilities. And so he's dedicated his life to helping people with issues, and of course these are big and small people as well. And so this little diagram he shares in one of his TED Talks, you can find it on YouTube, It's called What is Happening in the Brain of the Child with ADHD, the TED Talk they didn't want you to see. So I'm not sure why they didn't want you to see it, but this is in actual fact his diagram that he puts during this talk, and he starts to show you where primitive reflexes come in. So as we can see in this tiered pyramid that's moving up towards cognition and instruction and success in academics and better behavior, the absolute first tier is the primitive reflexes. Another one of my favorites is Dr. Josh Madsen. He's a doctor of chiropractic, fellow of the International Board of Functional Neurology, co-owner of Infinity Functional Neurology. He's got some lovely things that he puts up on Instagram. He's also got some podcasts that he does, and I will share the little video where I got this from. But again, we have a look at another pyramid where we see that these primitive reflexes are the absolute first tier of this pyramid. It is our foundations, and if our foundations aren't in place, if we think about development, but the rest then can't develop. And so here is him talking about it all over here.
Attention, behavioral issues, social interaction, cognitive skills. I want to explain to you the resources our body has to develop and the importance of creating a strong foundation for your child's neurological development for those higher cognitive functioning skills. So the first thing that we are born with are what are called primitive reflexes. This is my triangle of development. There's a lot more things in here like sensory integration, stuff like that. But the basic foundation is in the first year of life, we start to develop our primitive reflexes. We have lots of different reflexes, and there's much more than this, that should go away at certain time frames. Like for example, our asymmetrical tonic neck reflex should go away at 6 months of life before we start to crawl, so we can develop an efficient crawl. If it doesn't go away, it creates issues like handwriting issues, reading issues because the eyes can't track appropriately, difficulty learning to tie your shoes, and even balance issues. And all these reflexes, when they don't go away, are associated with different symptoms like that. Once these reflexes get developed in a child, we can now start working on their vestibular system and going on to that next system, because these reflexes have to go away for our balance centers to develop efficiently. So that way we have nice, solid, stable foundation for our head. Then we can start working on our eye tracking. Once all these systems are developed, it helps to develop our lower brain centers, and then those start firing into our higher cortex to develop our cognition. A lot of people want to skip ahead and work on cognitive skills like learning, but they have all these foundational issues underneath, like they can't track their eyes appropriately, or they have reflexes that are in the way, or they want to jump straight to doing vision therapy and ocular retraining where they can't balance to save their life, or they still have primitive reflexes. So when you address this in the appropriate manner and you work on reflexes at the appropriate time, then their balance centers, then their eyes, then cognitive skills, it is amazing the difference you see in how these kids develop and how they function in real life. So I hope this helps you guys. Have a wonderful day.
So while I'm sharing some of my favorite people here as well, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, British psychiatrist, philosopher, and neuroscientist. I absolutely love listening to him. I've bought one of his books, The Master and His Emissary. You can also go listen to him on YouTube. And again, he speaks so beautifully. It's really not hard to sit and just listen for hours on end. This is from his website. There's the link if it's something that you do want to go have a look at. And why I just bring this to you is because he has spent his whole career looking at the difference of the left and the right hemisphere. He was warned in the beginning by psychologists not to touch this, that this would be career suicide, and I actually think that inspired him even more so to ask the question, what is the difference between the hemispheres? And again, Dr. Robert Melillo has drawn on much of what he has found and discovered and researched, and of course Dr. Robert Melillo also talks about the differences that we find in the left and the right hemisphere. So again, he says, well, the pop psychology of the hemispheres has been shown to be largely false. It does not follow that the topic itself has been somehow debunked, just that our first thoughts have been superseded, as they were likely to be. People who think the topic is no longer important are stuck in the past and themselves embrace a myth that is well overdue debunking. They live in a self-perpetuating vacuum because they are just know there's nothing in it without bothering to acquaint themselves with the facts. They remain ignorant to the enormous body of mainstream research on the topic, For example, I refer to approximately 5,500 papers in the matter with things alone. The argument that there is not enough evidence might have been true 40 years ago, but it won't wash now. And again, yes, you can go read more up on that on his website and listen in on him on some of his YouTube podcasts. So Dr. Emma Gilchrist explains that even though we're looking at a brain that looks very symmetrical, it functions very asymmetrically. But having said that, he does actually say that there is this talk, this Jacobian talk that happens within the brain itself, where the right hemisphere is positioned slightly ahead of the left, and so it looks something like this. So very interesting that we do actually have a slight asymmetry within the brain structure itself. But then as an educational kinesiologist, this is where I get really excited, because in neurofeedback, in looking at these waves, we start to see something that we've discussed for years and years and years already before. And so if you remember, if you've done any of the courses, you remember our very first functional area is the backwards and the forwards part. Do I participate? Do I withdraw? Do I move forwards? Am I over-focused? Am I under-focused? And so we see brain energy in the brain. We see slower or the more medium brain waves. Our alpha brain waves need to be higher at the back of the brain. And our faster brain waves actually need to be at the front. And again, this is the type of energy we expect to have in these different regions to have the ability to do the work that it needs to do. And so there we go. Frontal lobes are expected to have more of the faster brain waves. The back of the head is meant to have more of the medium brain waves. And so what does Dr. Carla Hunneford have to say about this? This comes from her book, Smart Moves, Why Learning is Not All in the Head. And she talks about these children called the so-so kids, survival-orientated, stressed-out humans. And so from her book, she says here that when children rely on survival centers of the brainstem and the sympathetic nervous system, they focus too much on survival-related processing. This focus comes at a cost of rational, limbic, and cortical functions, particularly in the frontal lobe. As a result, there are fewer chances to develop nerve networks into the frontal lobe, which are essential for executive functioning skills. So just again, something very interesting to listen in on as we start thinking about these children who may be battling with that. Something else that we see in neurofeedback as we look at the different hemispheres, we expect medium brain waves to be the highest in the right. Okay. And we expect faster brain waves to be highest in the left. So important we listen to people again like Dr. Robert Malelo. There's also a lady called Erika Komisar who talks about the fact, and even Dr. Gabor Mate, it talks about the fact that when we are born, this right brain is really firing, and it's also that we can develop social skills so that we connect, so that we develop non-verbal skills. And that at about the age of 3, that's when the left brain really starts coming online, where our faster beaters are found. And again, language is to do with our faster brain waves. And so, of course, it's so interesting to see how these little 3-year-olds can jibber-jabber all the time and how this correlates with all of it. Okay, so again, this is a snippet from Dr. Robert Malelo. This is a YouTube conversation that he was talking about, particularly about kids on the spectrum and why they don't speak. However, in this conversation, he really explained beautifully how it is that the brain actually develops. And he even took the people listening through each of the developmental stages and what we should be seeing as each of the primitive reflexes do their job to reach the milestones and then go away. So let's take a listen.
Working their way up the brainstem into the brain, and then ultimately form the networks in the brain on the right and left side. And there's a balance also between what we call short-range connections and long-range connections. Short-range connections are what we see first in an immature brain. They form and they give local connectivity, and they're very powerful connections and slower brain waves. But then as the brain matures, we should lose some of those, and we should replace them with long-range connections that, now connect networks to one another and areas of the brain that are distant, and the two hemispheres should be connected together. That ratio of short range to long range connections is critical. There's a very specific algorithm. It's pretty complex. If we look at what's called graph theory, it's been calculated out, and it's different for different size brains. Human brains, again, are unique in that. But there's a very specific ratio. So that even with the exact same connections in the brain, what we can see is with a more immature ratio, where we have too many short range and not enough long range, it reduces the efficiency and speed of communication significantly, to be the difference between a person being a genius or the person being severely delayed. That alone could make a big difference. So we've actually done research, we've done studies, and other people have as well, where we've shown that in developmental delays, like dyslexia and autism and ADHD, that there's more short-range connections and less long-range connections. So what does that mean? It means that, again, the brain is in a more immature state. And this is what we showed with our research, because what we're saying is that when the brain doesn't fully, when the reflexes don't go away, it represents that the brain is still in a more immature state. And when they don't go away, they actually hold the brain back. They keep movement more simple. They keep the brain in a less complex state, and they really basically start to hold back brain development. When the brain cells grow, as the brain cells grow, they get bigger and thicker. We don't grow new cells, but they get bigger and thicker, and they get faster impulses. So what we see is brain waves get faster as the brain cell matures. And again, we showed studies that in autism spectrum and other disorders that they have slower brain waves, which represent immaturity of the brain.
So there was a scenario where I also was just caught off guard, teaching these kiddies and just finding that they were falling inside the head. So they just couldn't stay focused for long enough on what it was that I was saying, what it was that we're doing. And it was actually quite scary. So, yeah, I had to step back and say, stop panicking. What is it that you're seeing? And so I had this little conversation with myself, as every normal person tends to at times. And I said, that looks like theta. So theta, again, if we get back to our brain waves, theta is our slower brain wave. And our slower brain wave is all about thinking in pictures, jumping to conclusions, not thinking sequentially. And so these children are often very creative, very intuitive. But of course, this comes at a cost that they then battle with the language processing, that they might even battle with putting things in sequence and organizational skills, creating and maintaining tasks, for instance. And so I said to myself, I'm seeing that this is a theta type of behavior, that these children don't have the energy it takes to actually extend that awareness beyond themselves. And then I was reminded of this conversation where Dr. Robert Malala later on explains that every single child that he's ever had that has walked in with a diagnosis has had primitive reflexes. And so it was very clear to myself then in that moment, we need to start working on integrating these primitive reflexes. Let's check if these kids have it, which of course they did. And they were shouting out as we did the assessments. And then, of course, let's start there, and then we can use perhaps neurofeedback with that. But yes, this is something that when we understand what it is that we're looking at in terms of, and again, I don't diagnose, but in terms of brainwaves, in terms of reflexes, it becomes a far less scary place to be. And of course, it starts making sense why it is that I'm seeing what I'm seeing when these kiddies are sitting in front of me. So primitive reflexes is a big word that I think either you've heard and you're interested in, or it sounds like jargon. But what I want to do, which I can't obviously take you through a whole course on primitive reflexes tonight, is I want to show you some of the symptoms that are linked to these things. These automatic moves that are hijacking and overriding information coming into the brain and out. And so if we just had to look at learning, we can just see as they come up on the screen: poor concentration, difficulty completing tasks, difficulty shutting out background noise, auditory processing issues, speech and articulation issues, chewing on pencils and other things, difficulty developing fine motor, poor dexterity and pencil grip, stuttering and stammering, difficulty grasping concepts, difficulty with mathematics concepts, spelling issues, dyslexic type traits where they're reversing numbers and letters, difficulty constructing stories with flow, lying on the desk when they're writing, skipping words when they're reading, slow at copying off the board, spatial difficulties, poor sequencing skills, poor sense of time, trouble staying on task, difficulty perceiving sounds, poor handwriting, repeats lines when reading and writing, fidgeting, can't sit still, reading with no feeling, attention problems, hyperactivity, impulse control problems, poor short-term and long-term memory, vision skills, vision issues, and more. And so if you really want to learn more about these, as I say, we've got plenty of reflex courses. Sonia Hawkins is our RMTI trainer in South Africa, and she's busy doing even more courses to train even higher levels to people who are interested. And that would be the place if you really want to understand this more, how it is that we see it, how it is that it affects the kids, and what it is that we do to integrate these. That's the person that you need to get hold of. You're welcome to get in touch with me, and I will put you onto her. But I don't think people often realize, as we look at this, just to what extent they affect a kid. And this is why I've gone through them very quickly one by one. But I hope as we've read this list, and it's really just what I pulled very quickly out the list, we get to get a bit of a sense of this is a big deal. And so where do we see this in neurofeedback? You're now looking at a head, and of course I've put the brain so you can see the left and right hemisphere, and of course our dots where we'd be placing our electrodes. And so if we look at the temporal lobe, a lot of us might understand the different lobes, our temporal lobes, our parietal lobes, our frontal lobes, and our occipital lobes. So over here we're going to see this is to do with language and listening, and language and listening perception. On the other side we've got sound and voice perception. A little bit of a different spot as we include another dot on the head here. We've got listening and language comprehension, and voice and sound comprehension on that side. Very interesting place here on the head. In the parietal, we call this the central strip, where we move over that area that's responsible for our motor skills and also our sensory skills. So yeah, very important space, and that has to do with somatosensory perception. If we shift now more towards the back of the temporal lobe and going to the occipital there, we see this area of the brain also has to do with language and spelling perception, and language and reading comprehension, while the other side has to do with spatial and facial perception and comprehension. Our parietals, if we move over those dots, we start understanding that this has got something to do with maths. And then to the side, to the back side at the right, we have comprehending social skills dysfunction. And so if we don't have enough energy to actually meet again what these parts of the brain are meant to be doing, we might have challenges in the areas that we've now discussed. So neurological problems, again, the source of this information, Brain Trainer International. Please, we do not diagnose. We are merely looking for brain patterns as we look into the head and what it is that we're mapping in terms of neurofeedback. People who have studied psychology or are qualified to diagnose may use neurofeedback to confirm their findings, but that's not, this is, as I say, this is not a diagnostic tool. And all that I can present to you here this evening is some of the challenges that we might find in terms of energy and how they might link to symptoms that people might have in terms of diagnosis and all of that. So please, again, remember that I'm not sharing this for any other purpose than to show you some of the brain patterns that we come across and what people have linked to them, as I say. And so if we look at the prefrontal cortex, it's got everything to do with executive functioning skills. And so it's got to do with working memory, cognitive flexibility, inhibitory control, planning and organization, task initiation, time management, self-monitoring, and emotional regulation. If somebody has issues in these areas, they're going to have issues with perhaps memory, a working memory. They might be rigid, they might be impulsive, they battle with organizing and planning, they might battle to get started and procrastinate, they might not be able to finish things on within a certain time. And obviously we might have this problem with monitoring their own emotions. And so we see this pattern often with people who have got some sort of executive cognitive dysfunction, ADD type distractibility. So if we look at the left hemisphere, what that all has to do with, it's left hemisphere again, betas are to do with language, left to do with language. So obviously we're going to see LD, a language difficulty of sorts. People who also don't have the right amount of energy here in terms of brain waves, they're going to battle perhaps with depression and the inability to even feel positive emotions. If we have again this reversal or this energy that's not meeting what it needs to do on the right, we might have problems with impulse control, the inability to feel negative emotions, elevated anger, rage and fear, and dissociative identity disorders. If we look at the middle here, this is where we get hyper or hypoactivity disorder or motor dysfunctions, both gross and fine motor skills. And so again, we don't refer to it as that, but what we see with our medium brainwave, that should be across that central strip and across this particular point there, we see that the body should be able to relax. Remember that medium brainwave alpha relaxes, calms, allows somebody to feel present and in the moment. And of course our SMR allows us to connect to our body and have that sensation within the body itself. And so that person who can settle within oneself usually has enough of that energy that it needs to do so at this point. People who don't tend to have all these excessive movements in their body. This fidgeting that we often pick up, that goes alongside hyperactivity. Okay, a motivational in the middle. Again, if we don't have enough of what we need there, this middle part of the brain has everything to do with ambition and motivation. So when we do not have enough energy there, we're going to feel apathetic and we're really going to battle with being motivated. At the back here, this is all to do with obviously sensory integration. And so if we have disorders in the back there, when I say it's not disorders, sorry, when we have not enough energy that we need to actually integrate the information coming in at the back, we might find that this individual will have something like a neurosensory integration disorder. So looking back at the body again and our primitive reflexes, what do they do to our emotions? What symptoms, dare I say, do they have if they're still present in the body? We can find that kids might be, or a person might be emotionally immature, they might be withdrawn or have excess shyness, they might be very anxious and have big insecurities, a tendency to lash out. So you see that withdrawal refers to that flight response, while the lashing out to the fight, from the fight or flight combination there. Poor adaptability and a tendency to be inflexible, depression and despondency, unexplained fears, a tendency to be a loner, may be abrupt or rude, hyperactivity, manipulation or dominant behavior, difficulty connecting with others, defiant behavior, impulse behavior, poor self-esteem, unrealistic view of self. They may battle to let things go, a tendency to be secretive, obsessive compulsive symptoms, and needs constant reassurance. They might not be good listeners, they may be very argumentative, they may talk too much and interrupt, may lack emotional grounding, and might even be a perfectionist, difficulty with self-control, and trouble getting in touch with their own feelings, difficulty perceiving somebody else's viewpoint, and more. So again, very interesting how these may, sometimes we might not even think of these coming from a movement, an automatic movement within the body that's triggering certain emotions within a person. So very interesting. And if you want to find out again which one links to which reflex and how to integrate that, that would need to be done in one of our courses. So what about our emotions? Well, obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and even addiction, we can see in a brain pattern where we've got lots of activity in the midline on the brain. Dr. Daniel Amen talks about having a very active anterior cingulate gyrus, and he links this to serotonin, which is a gut issue. We also need to ask questions like, did you have a really bad strep virus somewhere along the line? And of course, if this is the case, it's beyond our scope of work. We have to steer people then to either homeopaths or doctors or nutritionists so that they can actually start sorting out physically what's going on in the body. We then look at the side of the brain, and here's where we see our emotional disorders. Very interesting is our right side of the head has to do with big emotional demonstrations. Sometimes when these people are acting this way, they don't always remember the event or why it is that they're doing so. Whereas the left side is where somebody can tell you what's happened to them, sometimes even a very big scary event that's happened to them. Almost as though they're just telling a story of something that happened to someone else, where there's this lack of emotion. And so very interesting again how we see the two sides of the head respond differently to emotions. At the back here we're in the temporal. The back part of the head often reminds me of our back reflexes. What we see in our back reflexes, like our spinal gland, our parese, our vulmina, which have a lot to do with the ability to listen, with auditory processing, with being able to sit still in the chair and take things in, to assimilate information basically. We see it in the head so beautifully also at the side to the back as we look at the temporals. And so we see memory dysfunction if we have issues here, auditory issues with language and listening. And then on the other side also memory dysfunction, and of course here auditory but also pertaining to sound and voice. So that slight difference again as the brain attends differently to the information coming in. At the back we have a memory dysfunction again, but of course being more at the back, close to the occipitals, we see visual being brought in here. And again, the left to do with language and reading, and then the right more spatial and facial. Okay, phenotypes. What is a phenotype? So a phenotype is like an observable characteristic or behavior that we find in a person or a thing. And most of the time these are considered to be genetic or a fingerprint. And so while we can definitely train a lot of the brain patterns that we are going to be mentioning and we see, it also does mean that if we had to reassess, you might still find that you have this fingerprint that's still evident in your brain mapping. But what we want to ask then is if you were battling, for instance, with concentration, when you need to concentrate, has that changed for you? Are you able to shift and do what you need to do? Very important in neurofeedback. We're not training to create beautiful graphs because you're never going to print your brain mapping session and then hang it on the wall. We're training so that you can experience improved functioning. And that's what our mark is if we've had success through brain training. So let's just take a look at some of these. Our first one is this highly strung person, and they tend to have this fingerprint, this phenotype, which is a low voltage fast brainwave. This person doesn't calm easily. We see stuff like anxiety, agitation, difficulty calming. They battle with falling asleep. When we have this kind of brain pattern come up in our data, we need to ask them about post-traumatic stress disorder. We need to ask them if they're always on the hyper alert type. We need to ask if they sleep properly, because chronic poor sleep can also lead to this pattern. This is usually a pattern that we see in high functioning people, in sports people, in executives. And they will usually come in asking they need help with sleep or for peak performance training. And what we need to be on the lookout with this type of person is that they may be masking anxiety or even chemical dependencies. Another one here, we got low voltage but on the slow brain wave here. So again, we're not going to have tall waves, but rather small waves, but slow waves here. And this is associated with low metabolic energy. We can see this with people with chronic fatigue syndrome, and if that is the case, they usually would have consulted other people first, feeling quite rotten. But if they haven't, we need to ask them to also go see someone like that to look at the toxins in their body. They present, as I say, with low energy, with apathy, and this may be a result to heavy metal poisoning, to acquired brain injuries such as anoxia, thyroid issues, and this is why we need to get somebody involved when we see this brain pattern. This brain pattern, diffuse slow activity, in terms of what we're looking at, we'll often see a down or downhill slope in our graph. And what that means, it means that we've got a lot of the slower brain waves. Those are the taller ones that we're seeing first. And then, of course, we're seeing less of the medium brain waves and then very little of the fast brain waves. Now, our medium brain waves help us filter out excess information. And so when we don't have enough of this, it means a whole lot of sensory stimuli is sent forward for processing. So the clock ticking, the kid clicking the pen, the bird flapping outside. This is not stuff that we need to be made aware of. And so these kind of kids become very distracted by this extra stuff that's being sent forward to take note of. And even more so with this little pattern is there isn't enough of the fast brainwave to actually process all of that. And so it's obviously no surprise why this is common in children with ADHD and ASD. And depending where we see this downward slope, we're going to see different things. So if it's in the front, we're going to see attention and focus issues, impulsivity, and even obsessive behavior, overfocus, and mental rigidity. If it's in the middle, we're going to see possibly attention and focus issues, coordination and clumsiness, again, because now it's starting to happen over those motor places in the brain. And of course, if we see it at the back posterior, we're going to see it interfering with sensory integration. And these people might battle with sensory overload or sensitivities. This pattern is again considered to be inherited. And of course, when we've got kids who've had issues at birth, we can expect more severe symptoms along with ADHD. So of course, like cerebral palsy and others like that. Okay, this one is called our scoop. When we look at it in terms of our graph, we see that we've got a mixture of fast and slow brain waves with a dip in the middle. So the fast brain waves are felt to be compensating in this case for the slow. So we get impulsive ADHD is believed to be this pattern. And lots of people also believe that this could be a result of poor sleep. Again, if you know anything about your primitive reflexes, your brain is going back to fear paralysis reflex and the Moro, which has got so much, especially the fear paralysis, to do with sleep and sleep patterns. Common in children with ADHD and with ASD. The presence of the fast brain wave is usually a sign of high intelligence because it's trying to compensate. And these children may be doing well at school, but they're probably not doing as well as they could because they are spending just so much energy trying to compensate for the slow brain waves. Okay, elliptiform and paroxysmal, I hope I say that right, it's always a tongue twister for me. This is just to show again that we see an instability in the EEG and a lack of thalamatic control over the affected areas. So this has to do, obviously, when we see some epileptic forms within the EEG, discharges interrupt ongoing processing, and what we find with obviously people who have some form of seizure is that information is lost when that happens. Dr. Barry Sturman stumbled across some protocols which are very useful for people with epilepsy. Way back when he was treating cats with this SMR protocol, which they absolutely loved because it made them feel so beautiful and so wonderful. And then a short time later he was asked to test rocket fuel, what it would do on a body, and he chose 100 cats to do so, of which 15 were of this other study that he'd done with this SMR. And what he found was that many of these cats that had this rocket fuel injected into them were having seizures and then they were dying. However, there were some cats that weren't. And he then realized it was in actual fact the cats that were the cats that he had done this whole SMR experiment on. And so there became this understanding that there was this link between the cats that weren't having these seizures and these cats that had had this SMR training. His receptionist, so the story goes at the time, got wind of this, and she had had epilepsy, and she decided that this was affecting her life negatively enough for her to actually try this out on herself. And of course, she had a lot of success with these protocols. And so this is where this link came from. So just to continue with our phenotype, we spoke earlier on about having slower brainwaves on the right and faster on the left. When we don't have this combination, it's called a reversal. So if you have too much slow on the left, you might have a sense of slowed depression. If you have too much fast on the right, we're going to see anxiety and agitation. And so some of the things we're going to see here is agitation, agitated depression, emotional outbursts, high anxiety, and aggression. We also spoke about the pattern where we had the front we needed faster and the back medium brain waves. So if we have too much of the medium brain waves or slow in the front, this is actually a sign that we don't have enough oxygen and nutrients going to the front of the brain. This would be a great place to use HEG to train up that blood flow to that front part of the brain there. And of course, with this issue, we're going to have poor focus, attention, poor memory, poor emotional regulation, perhaps some impulse control issues. This, as we said earlier, is a common pattern that we see in children with ADHD. And if there is excessive medium brain waves, we're also going to see anxiety. Also, post-traumatic stress disorder, the dissociation part of this, can also be due to excess alpha being the medium brain waves, either centrally or in the front. Medium brain waves, really important. So if we have fast medium brain waves, we end up with a very quick thinking brain. It's often our medium brain waves that allow us to understand the intelligence of a person. And so this fast brain could also, though, result in sleep issues, anxiety, and agitation. Slow medium brain waves may result from poor sleep or from illness. We see lower intellectual functioning sometimes with this. And obviously it would really help to improve the sleep of such individuals, direct them perhaps to a homeopath or a nutritionist to just help them improve their health as well. But of course, again, no surprise why this slows with aging as we become less physical when we get older, perhaps more unwell, and also our sleep tends to worsen. Fast brain waves that spindle. So this we see this often with people with severe anxiety, OCD symptoms, and with bipolar behavior. So what happens here with the manic behavior, we see this rise and wane with cortisol levels, and this leads to moods and energy cycling. When the energy drops, these people tend to need to sleep or eat, which then replenishes these cortisol levels, and then they move back into a manic phase. However, it doesn't matter where they are in the cycle, because we will see the spindle in the EEG. Spindles at the back of the head may also result in sensory sensitivities. Medium brain waves that don't drop. So these beautiful medium brain waves are supposed to increase when our eyes close and we shift from looking or attending to our external world and starting to go within. And when we see this pattern that they don't drop with our eyes opening, we might have the following. So if it's in the front, we might have obsessive behavior, anxious overfocus, and OCD. We've spoken about this pattern before. We see this may indicate apathy and a lack of motivation or depression. When we see this in the center, it leads to or links with poor focus, anxiety, perhaps even post-traumatic stress disorder, the dissociation form of that again. And when we see it at the back, we see a person who likes to be in their own world, doesn't respond quickly, and also may be battling with sensory integration, exhaustion, and this also might be because of a chronic lack of sleep. Our cingulate dysfunction, also something we spoke about before. We see here OCD, obsessive overfocus, addiction, oppositionality, apathy, and again, lack of motivation. So when will brain training and neurofeedback not work? So to answer that question, we just have to remind ourselves of how it does work. So neurofeedback is all about creating new neural pathways and then reinforcing these. And we have to do so until they get to a point where they become the preferred way of functioning. When this happens and the brain continues to rather choose these new neural pathways, the old ones become redundant and are then pruned. And so for this to happen, sessions must be done for long enough and often enough. We can't do sessions when clients are tired or falling asleep, because an asleep brain looks very different in terms of its brain waves to an awake one. Clients can't move too much during a session because, again, our software is very sensitive, and a client that keeps moving, that movement is going to be picked up by our software as brain activity, and then we will actually be training the body and not the brain. What we want our clients to start noticing is the positive changes that they're feeling in a session need to start sticking. So we ask clients to notice how long after a session do they feel good. And we ask them then to start noticing where the gap between sessions start closing. This is a very good sign for us to start understanding that we've reached that pivotal moment in our brain training session or journey, where the brain has now started to choose rather than new brain waves. And so one criticism I've come across with neurofeedback is a person saying that they felt good during a session, but the minute they stopped the neurofeedback, all that change stopped. And that again for me is an indication that that person actually didn't continue as long as they should have on with their brain training sessions, and that they didn't reach that pivotal moment where the brain then chose the new pathways over the old. Another pointer here is when people speak about having a negative or a bad session, where they've had a headache or they felt a bit agitated. And again, because this whole process is about reinforcing these new pathways, that is really not a concern, but rather something that needs to be voiced when you go to your next session. In that case, sometimes what has happened is that the target that was set was just a little bit too ambitious for your brain, and that your brain ended up working a little bit harder than it should have. And in order to make sure that you don't experience those negative feelings, that target just needs to be made or readjusted, so it's a gentler approach to your change that you wanted to have made. How permanent are these pathways? So these pathways, these new ones that we've now created and reinforced and strengthened, become just as permanent as your old ones. And so again, as the brain starts choosing these new pathways, as I've explained, the old ones will become redundant and will eventually be done away with. And so just before we head into questions and discussions, if you want to find out anything more about neurofeedback, how to make an appointment, and all of that, as well as educate, you're welcome to get hold of me, Kerry Ann Gordon. You can check out my website, www.mindfulmoves.co.za. And if you want to find out more about our reflex courses, rhythmic movement training level 1 and 2 courses are given by Sonia Hawkins. All of the doctors and of course the Brain Trainer International who I studied through, and all the things that I gave reference to tonight are here. Jot down the names, Google them, go listen to some of their podcasts. Really nice information out there, and really a great space for perhaps you to move into if this is something that you're interested in and just want time to take in a little bit more about what they say.